Risk of Rain is an indie developer's success story. Risk of Rain was an indie developer's success story. The new update breaks the flow of the game so dramatically, even Gearbox continues to prove time and time again how incompetent this game is not worth buying in its current company who can make gold worthless. Gearbox broke one of my favorite games. Trash. Thank you, Gearbox, for ruining a great game. Do not buy it in its current state. Hopoo Games, an indie game development studio, started in 2012 by University of Washington students and childhood friends Duncan Drummond and Paul Morse, created the massively popular roguelike platformer Risk of Rain, releasing the original title in their final year at university in 2013. After the success of the original, a sequel was highly anticipated and finally announced to be in development in 2016. By 2017, the first piece of information came out of the game that it had adapted a 3D perspective opposed to the 2D style from the original. The team behind Hopoo Games had grown from its humble beginnings of 2 university students and grew to a small dedicated team of artists and programmers, one of which being Jeffrey Hunt, otherwise known as Gore or Gorington, who we will talk about later in this video. Still being a small team, Hopoo Games were committed to creating games that they were passionate about, and that came all the way down to the core design of the game. They released little information about the game during its early phases of development because they wanted to ensure that they did right by not only the franchise, but the players, and more importantly, themselves. They wanted to make sure that a sequel was a viable concept and that it would maintain the values that they had when making the first game. In early 2019, 3 years into development, Risk of Rain 2 went into early access on Windows, with the team at Hopoo Games predicting at least another year of development before the full release. Early access of the game was once again met extremely positively, and it was around this time that Hopoo Games signed with Gearbox Publishing, who would be in charge of releasing the games on all consoles, and later, the Seekers of the Storm DLC. Risk of Rain 2 was released out of early access in August of 2020, and by March of 2021 had sold over 4 million copies on Steam alone, with hundreds and thousands of positive reviews, nominations for some of the biggest awards in the games industry, and some extremely high scores from publications. Risk of Rain 2 was seen as a success. In November of 2022, a couple years after Risk of Rain 2's release, Gearbox Entertainment, who were an extremely well-known video game company, having worked on titles like Half-Life, Duke Nukem, and probably their most successful franchise, Borderlands, who had also been the publisher for Risk of Rain 2 on various platforms, had acquired the rights of the Risk of Rain IP from Hopoo Games. In other words, bought the franchise from them. Hopoo Games would continue to work with Gearbox for a little while longer, releasing Risk of Rain Returns, a reboot of the original 2013 title, in 2023. Since then, Hopoo Games have returned to their roots and continue to work as an independent studio, which during the time of writing this video have actually announced their plans to work with Valve on games going forward. Jumping back a little, during the development of Risk of Rain 2, Drummond and Morse took a step back from programming and took on the more managerial roles of producers and creative directors, with the lead programmer of Risk of Rain 2 going to Gore, who I mentioned earlier. Gore worked with Hopoo Games from 2016 until 2021, and seemingly left due to creative differences between them, but he still moderates and is extremely active in the official Risk of Rain Discord. In November of 2023, 1 year after Gearbox acquired the Risk of Rain IP, the second expansion to Risk of Rain 2 was announced, Seekers of the Storm, before later being released on August 27, 2024. Within hours of the release of this expansion, Risk of Rain 2 was under a lot of negative press due to the apparent bugs and glitches in the game. Straying away from the GameMaker engine that Risk of Rain 1 was originally created in, Risk of Rain 2 was developed in Unity 3D and allowed for modding support. There are communities and dedicated programmers, or modders, who have built infrastructures and APIs on understanding the Risk of Rain 2 codebase, basically to allow full support of modifying the game. And it's through this documentation that programmers, who aren't a part of the Gearbox team, can actually access the code. Obviously they can't make changes to the live Steam builds, but they can create their own builds, with some limitations. Generally this is for extra gameplay content, cosmetics, or extra features or functionality for gameplay support. After the release of the Seekers of the Storm DLC, and with an updated access to the codebase, programmers from the modding community quickly came to realize some of the core issues in the new logic. And as a game developer myself, I'll give a quick breakdown and example of this code, and maybe you can empathize with Gore on what the new developers at Gearbox have done to his code. The example I want to highlight in this video is their misuse of delta time and fixed delta time. found this article online that I think best describes exactly what frame rate dependencies are in games, and I'll also show a practical example of how that looks in a game. Frame rate independent games are games that run at the same speed no matter the frame rate. For example, a game might run at 30 FPS on a slow computer and 60 FPS on a fast one. A frame rate independent game progresses at the same speed on both computers. The objects appear to move at the same time. But on the other hand, a frame rate dependent game progresses at half the speed on the slow computer, in a sort of slow motion effect. Now what the developers at Gearbox have done is actually altered parts of the code of the main game, not just the code for the Seekers of the Storm DLC, to act on frame rate dependency. This means that depending on the device used and the system and hardware limitation, there will be some obvious jittering or stuttering. I've got a new Unity project here to show exactly how that responds in an actual game scenario. If you notice in the log messages here, for every spacebar pressed in the fixed update loop, there's about a dozen more in the update loop. A better visualization of this will be with movement, and to do that I'll do a side-by-side comparison. One circle will use the update loop, and one circle will use the fixed update loop. To the bare eye, you may not even notice it, but if we look at the values of the transform position, we can definitely notice that they're different. And when it comes to a precision platformer like Risk of Rain 2, where timing is crucial to the core aspects of the gameplay, to use frame rate dependent properties on physics related things, you're opening yourself up to a lot of issues with the playability of the game. Basically everything that has come as a result of this DLC, and ultimately causing my friend Robbie to demand a refund for the DLC. There's a lot of reasons this could have happened, and from a game developer perspective, I want to believe it was a result of an unfamiliarity to not only the codebase, but the engine as well. So I don't want to fault the developers too much. What concerns me more is how this went unnoticed. With a studio and company as big as Gearbox, there should have been better practices in place for the quality assurance aspect, because as it stands, they released this product without realizing how broken it was. And it's why quality assurance exists in the first place, to test on multiple products, platforms, and hardware to find these issues. There were aspects of the code that they changed for this DLC that exist outside of the DLC. So even if you didn't purchase Seekers of the Storm, there would have been an update to your copy of the game regardless, and the frame rate issues would still be present. So nobody is safe. On August 31st, 4 days after the release of the Seekers of the Storm, Gearbox made a statement about the post-launch feedback and some plans that they have for a patch on the game for PC. The first patch update was released on September 5th, addressing a handful of these issues, but the community is still upset, and rightfully so. There seems to have been a lack of care going into this DLC, which went against the philosophies of the original developers. After having built a strong community over the last decade, fans are passionate about the state of the game, and to see it the way it is now can only be at the fault of Gearbox. For Hopoo Games to sell their product and their intellectual property, the bare minimum would be to hope that the game is continued to be taken care of, and for it to be released in the state that it was, has definitely damaged the trust and reputation of Gearbox.